Yo, listen up. Here's a story about little blue guys that spread the greater good, and all day and all night, until everywhere he sees is the Guela, who hate him inside and outside. They blew up his house with a blue little window, and his yellow hammerhead too. And everything was the greater good for himself and everybody around him, 'cause the Inquisition ain't got no time to listen
to Xeno.
The greater good.
How can this be for the greater good?
The greater good.
Welcome back to a new episode of A Tanker's View with me, with your average tanker, Tony. This week we are looking at the Tau Hammerhead, because if I'm going to hate on one hover tank, let's hate on them all. But before I can continue, if you could do the YouTube thing, like, comment, subscribe, and share, I'd really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for watching. The Tau, a subject of much debate and much memery. A tiny but potent upstart Xenos empire that has risen from a bunch of Stone Age rock-banging troglodytes to a spacefaring interstellar empire in under 6,000 years. I would say good job, but this is 40K, and absolutely nothing is benign in the grim darkness of the far future. Leaving aside the utter ridiculousness and naivete of their fledgling commie block empire, their technological edge is nothing to be scoffed at, but the design of their war machines is sometimes just really doesn't reflect it. For argument, I give you the Hammerhead. This looks almost familiar, like I just crapped on something like this, maybe. So to reiterate, I am no 40K lore master. I take what I see and what I can find in a few days of research and look at it from a basic bitch tanker's perspective. Now everyone and their inquisitorial shadow knows that the Tau fight at range because they are the smaller and comparatively weaker Xenos compared to the Great Devourer, the Greenskins, or the deceitful Eldari. They lack the capacity to close with and destroy the enemy effectively, and rely solely on drones and long-range engagement strategies to leverage their strengths over their extraordinarily obvious weaknesses. Keeping it long-range has its advantages if you, say, don't have a lot of numbers, supply issues, or your enemy has a penchant for bayonet charges and weapons made of chainsaws. But it also provides several distinct disadvantages. It's a largely defensive strategy. It's very easy to lose the momentum in the fight, and it makes it very difficult to concentrate fire effectively. So taking all of this into account, we can better understand this odd, but effective Xenos device that doesn't work, but somehow it does. So, let's take a look at this tank. Now, as a general overview, I can already see a few things wrong with this, and I really should know where to begin. Well, really, I do know where to begin. It's a Xenos piece of crap, but I'll start with the issue I take with most hover or anti-grav vehicles, the lack of mitigation for recoil. And to illustrate my point, here's my whiteboard again. Contrary to many opinions, all weapons that emit a beam or projectile have recoil. It doesn't matter if it's a handheld phaser from Star Trek, the PPC from B5, or a Vulcan Mega Bolter. They've all got recoil. It could be so minuscule as to be barely felt at all, or it could require the mass of a Titan to keep it in check. Most hover vehicles don't try to take this into account. Well, this one tries, but it still falls kind of short, and let me explain why. You see these massive jet engines on the back of the sides? These are big, glaring weakness, and yes, they will counter the recoil, but they are loud, power-intensive, massive twofold weaknesses, despite having soft kill countermeasures. Now, the biggest flaw in the design is the huge intakes. Look at the sheer size of them in comparison to the rest of the vehicle. Then look at the location. Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I'm no Oxford scholar, but I'm not an effing idiot either. The massive intakes tell me it's an air-breathing vehicle. Therefore, putting something open-mouthed, close to the ground, is an invitation to get something sucked into it and break your tank, be it a missile, big rocks, or the flying bodies of your puny infantry. If the Tau had any common sense, they would hard-mount the intakes into a protected position in the hull and move the nozzles to armored blisters on the rear quadrant with vectoring nozzles. Okay, so that was the first biggest gripe I had. The next is the big old shot traps on either flank. What in Gilliman's perpetually clutching butt cheeks is this? A quick aside, from what I can tell, it's more pronounced on some models more than others, but on the majority of them it seems to be present. Now, given the profile of this thing, arse to nose, you chose to give it Zoolander cheeks? Even the Imperium doesn't install bowl-shaped shot traps on its vehicles. The eternally high on their own supply Tau, of course, couldn't figure out the basics of regular angular armor on their tanks. What the shit, guys? Like, holy terror on roller skates. Let's move on before I have a stroke. Well, shit, it's too late. I just saw the weapons pods on the nose. So, the whole point of underslung weapons pods is to use elevation to their advantage. This is why we put them on aircraft. So, why in the name of the Emperor's golden testicles would you put them on a vehicle that's intended to operate at most a few feet off the ground? You know what sucks? When you smash your damn weapons off the machine you signed for. The Tau's quartermaster's gonna break his hoof off in the ass of the private for the greater good.
It's all about the greater good.
The greater good.
You know what sucks even harder than that? Being unable to effectively leverage all of your weapons because you land out on a planet that doesn't have 6 inches of level ground, or land on a planet with vegetation as robust as Catachan, for God's sake. For Fulgrim's sake here, it's either a tank or it's a close air support vehicle. If you try to do something with both, you're going to get something that's going to fail at the job spectacularly. Because again, you're only going to be able to leverage half of your weapons effectively. Also, putting missile pods on the front of air-breathing jets is a real bad idea, unless you want to stall them out every time you fire. But that's neither here nor there. To add on to the point about the whole close air support vehicle or tank issue, yes, this thing has an ability to jump. It is an advantage, but it's balanced against a massive disadvantage. To jump an obstacle, it does something every tanker and soldier tries to avoid: silhouetting yourself against the horizon. No matter how fast you can move, all it takes is one competent commander on the other side of a hill to anticipate this little trick and turn your shiny tanks into lemon blueberry confetti. Now, let's talk about the long throbbing arm of the greater good.
How can this be for the greater good?
The greater good.
Shut it!
Or the railgun as everyone else calls it. Now, railguns come in two varieties: standard barrel type and recoilless, although recoilless is a bit of a misnomer, but it's still vastly reduced in comparison to the barrel type. I'll show you a visual representation of both here. The first being from the American Railgun Project, and the second being from The Expanse. This is where the recoilless types are more needed, when there's nothing around to absorb the massive recoil, like the vacuum of space or the cushion of air you're hovering on. Moving on to the range and ballistic trajectory of all railgun rounds in comparison to the battlefields it's deployed on. Now, on paper, railguns are absolutely amazing. They can punch large holes in pretty much anything you need perforated. The amount of kinetic energy they transfer per cost of unit fired is among one of the holy grails of warfare, and needing only to store inert metal projectiles instead of volatile chemical shells is a huge boon to survivability of the crew and cost. Now, here's the huge problem with railguns: trajectory. The ballistic trajectory of railgun rounds is measured in the hundreds of kilometers. Even our own naval railgun would have a projective range of 342 miles, or 550 kilometers, with a accuracy of approximately 1 meter, or 3 feet and 4 inches in freedom fractions. Now, maintaining the destructive properties of a naval 5-inch shell at the same time. Whereas a chemical round is typically limited to a maximum of 21 to 25 miles, or 50 to 60 kilometers. Now, it has an easier ballistic arc to compensate for the shorter distance on the battlefield, and to deal with issues of coverment and concealment. Now, most battlefields are shorter than that by comparison, rarely exceeding a few tens of miles in depth, and that's just on the front line. I understand that a war can cover a whole planet, and to boot, that isn't going to be flat terrain, nor will your foe likely to be choosing battlefields conducive to their enemy's strength unless the plot calls for it. But I guess that part will be based on whoever has the battlefield initiative. Now, if we take that into account, we can assume that these tanks will constantly have to jump to clear obstacles to score hits at range. Now, if a commander is willing to absorb some losses, it wouldn't take very long to pin down the pattern and leverage long-range artillery against it. Now you say, why don't you just turn down the power of the railgun to control the range? Well, when you slow down a railgun projectile to control its range, you remove its one redeeming feature: the ability to transfer massive levels of kinetic energy. Now, if you're going to do that, you might as well throw lawn darts for all the damage it's going to do overall. So, how would I fix this and make it more better? Well, it boils down to two things that I've mentioned before. I would streamline those jet thrusters, and I'd move the damn underslung weapons off of the ground and into elevated positions on the top of the nose of the hull. Finally, I'd probably recenter that railgun just to even out the forces involved in recoil. Maybe even switch the design to a soft assist recoilless. But G-Dubs isn't ever going to hire me to tell them what they're doing wrong, so I'm just screaming into the void here. Anyway, guys and gals, that's going to be it for me on this episode of A Tanker's View. If you like what I'm doing here and maybe you want to buy me a coffee about it, my coffee link is in the description down below. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And with that, I will see you absolute legends next time.